Welcome, everyone, and happy International Education Week. I do just want to send a thank you to the World Affairs Council of Kentucky or of Northern Kentucky and Cincinnati. Thank you so much for organizing and hosting this International Education Week Summit, which is meant to raise student awareness of global issues and global careers. Thank you so much for inviting the Cleveland Council on World Affairs to join you in this important work. My name is Elizabeth Coerdt, and I am the Manager of Global Education at the Cleveland Council on World Affairs. I've been with the Council for a little over 2 years now in developing professional development opportunities in global education. And prior to joining the Council, I actually worked as a teacher at the Breakthrough Schools in Cleveland, Ohio, so I am quite familiar with the classroom context as well. Now, throughout today's webinar, I'm going to be sharing educational resources to address this challenging topic of global protests in your classroom. The mission of the Cleveland Council on World Affairs is to inspire engagement in international affairs and world cultures through education, citizen diplomacy, and public dialogue. And in that same vein, I hope that today's webinar inspires you to address the recent global protests with your students. We have two objectives for today's webinar: to learn about resources and activities that are helpful in teaching and discussing global protests, including the Black Lives Matter movement, and to foster ideas to use the resources provided to discuss the global protests, demonstrations, and movements in your classroom. At the Cleveland Council on World Affairs, we believe that this all comes back to global education. Addressing and discussing current affairs with students is really at the heart of global education. Students need to have the knowledge and understanding to address issues that cut across borders. They need to be able to communicate and work collaboratively with their peers to address these global challenges. And I think that this quote from the Center for Human Interdependence really sums it all up. Global education is learning about these problems and issues that cut across national boundaries, and about the interconnectedness of systems: ecological, cultural, economic, political, and technological. Global education involves perspective taking, seeing things through the eyes and minds of others. As we progress through this afternoon's webinar, I ask that you keep this quote in mind. If we're teaching students to be globally minded citizens, it is critical for them to have an understanding of the world. So I ask that you consider what students know about where current protests and movements are happening. How much do your students know about these countries and regions of the world? How much do you think your students know about the challenges these people are facing and about their current frustrations? People in more countries than ever are using people power now more than in any other time in recorded history. These nonviolent mass movements are the primary challenges to governments today. And this represents a pronounced shift in the global landscape of dissent. In 2019, mass protests broke out in countries from Lebanon and Spain to Chile and Bolivia, all of which were different with distinct causes, methods, and goals, but there were some common themes and threads that connected these movements. Protests had begun for similar reasons in several countries, and some of which have taken inspiration from one another on how to best organize and advance their goals. One reason why global protests are arising is due to inequality. Many of those who are protesting are people who have long felt shut out of the wealth of their country. And in several cases, a rise in prices for key services proved to be the final straw, as was the case in Ecuador, Bolivia, and Chile. Claims of government corruption are also at the heart of several protests, and these are closely linked to this issue of inequality. In some countries, protesters are angered by political systems in which they feel trapped. So think about the protests in Spain by Catalan protesters, as well as those pro-democracy movements in Hong Kong. Many protests are also linked to the environment and climate change, as activists have been protesting in cities around the world demanding urgent action from governments. These protests have taken place in countries including the US, the UK, Germany, Spain, Austria, France, and New Zealand. And of course, many people across the world are protesting in response to the police killing of George Floyd and in support of the Black Lives Matter movement. So throughout the next hour, I'm going to be sharing some resources to break down these global protests for your students. One helpful resource to explore protests around the world is the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which is a foreign policy think tank dedicated to advancing cooperation between nations and to promoting active international engagement by the United States. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace has put together a tool to help students track and understand protests globally, called the Global Protest Tracker. Now, within the Global Protest Tracker, there is a map that shows where demonstrations are taking place across the world. And this might be helpful for students to examine protests by region. I'll also note that the map is continuously updated as new protests and movements arise. This tracker also breaks down protests and demonstrations by country and allows you to filter the results. So if you click this addition sign that you see on the left-hand side of the screen, this will expand the protest, and you will be able to see outlined the trigger of the protest, the motivation, the key participants, and the outcome, if applicable. So the example that I pulled here is from the police killing of George Floyd, and it's looking at related protests that are occurring within the United States. Now, you may also note that there is a filter in the top right-hand corner by COVID-19. And these look at protests opposing the coronavirus lockdowns and prison protests, which might be interesting for students to explore given our current environment. Another wonderful resource to explore global protests with students is the Pulitzer Center. The Pulitzer Center raises awareness of underreported global issues through direct support for journalism across all media platforms and through education programs as well as public outreach. They provide grant funding to support 150 projects each year. These are underreported stories on issues ranging from migration and human rights to climate change and global health. And these are just a few of the places that stories funded by the Pulitzer Center have been published. So here is a deeper look at some of the topics that journalists investigate with Pulitzer Center grants. They specifically support teachers in many ways, including lesson plans that are associated with the topics you see here, student contests, and virtual journalist visits. Their education mission is to cultivate a more curious, informed, empathetic, and engaged public by connecting students and teachers with these underreported global news stories and the journalists who cover them. Now, in covering news stories around the globe, the Pulitzer Center has many free lesson plans that address protests and movements across the world. One in particular that I think might be helpful is a lesson plan titled Young People's Revolutions, Examining Youth Movements Around the World, which explores youth-led movements in 4 regions. In this free lesson plan, you may choose to either assign students to one of these 4 case studies, or you could have students choose the country that is of interest to them. Students will then read a story about the movement happening in their country, and reflect upon the cause and result using graphic organizers provided by the Pulitzer Center. Throughout this lesson, students also keep in mind these questions. What do young people in this country care about? If you were to live in this country, how would you respond? And what is happening as a result of young people's actions? So I think that this lesson is particularly timely because it really focuses on young people as a part of the movement, which I think might be helpful in a classroom setting, especially if you have middle school or high school students. So just to say a few more words about each of these case studies, the case study in Tunisia explores Tunisian youth protests over poverty and unemployment at the start of the Arab Spring. Venezuela is a photo story that looks into Venezuelans' uprising against authoritarianism, hunger, and the economy. The India Kashmir case study shines a light on the long-standing struggle for independence in Kashmir, highlighting the different tactics of militants and a new generation of peaceful protesters. And the Philippines story looks at human rights abuses which have prompted youth to take to the streets in the Philippines. Now, after each student group has read through their case study, reflected upon the cause and result of the protest or movement in their assigned country, and considered these three questions, the class would then come together to engage in a whole group discussion and reflect upon questions that connect these international protests to their own communities. So these questions might include asking students, what forms of social action are young people in your community or in your country taking part of right now? What are some of the causes of these youth movements in your community or country? How do these movements compare with those in Tunisia, Venezuela, Kashmir, and the Philippines? You might also ask students to compare some of the similarities and differences between the government's response to protests in your case study countries and the US government's response to our current protests. And I would also encourage you to ask students if they were in the situation of the young people in these countries, what would they do? How would they take action? Now, this is just one of the many lesson plans developed by the Pulitzer Center, and I certainly encourage you to further explore their website for other topical lessons. As I previously shared, the Pulitzer Center also offers virtual journalist visits for students grades 5 through 12. This is a list of just a few of the journalists that are available to speak to students. And I think this would be especially helpful in an online or blended learning environment, as you would be able to set up a Zoom call with one or more of these potential speakers. Now, shifting to another resource, I know a few of you on the call are familiar with the Choices program, but for those of you that might be unfamiliar, another wonderful resource is the Choices program, which is developed by Brown University's Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. As we know, to become engaged with current events like global protests, students need resources that help them to better understand and unpack these issues. And this includes the historical context that led to our present-day challenges, as well as current policy discussions and resources to determine one's own informed opinion about a particular issue. The Choices program seeks to empower students to think critically about the past and consider how it shapes our present, as well as to show students how to apply historical knowledge and critical thinking skills to gain a deeper, better understanding of current issues. They do so through discourse and decision-making as well. Now, this program offers over 35 curriculum units, which you can explore on their website. And these units look at both current affairs and historical events. All of their units are aligned to Common Core, C3, and state standards, and they are all designed for 9th through 12th grades, but they can be adapted for 5th through 8th grades. Now, in addition to these curriculum units offered, Choices also prepares free 1 to 2 day long teaching with the news lessons, and all of these can be found online. Now, these lessons are appropriately titled Teaching with the News, as all of these lessons focus on current events. One of the recent Teaching with the News lessons looks at 2019 as the year of global protests. And again, all of the resources for this lesson are free and can be found online. Within this lesson, students examine photographs of protests from around the world. Students conduct research in multiple news and media outlets about global current events. Students will analyze the origins and causes of movements and identify similarities, differences, and patterns. And they will consider the role and significance of protests within democracies. So I'm going to walk you through a few of the key components of this lesson so that you understand how this might play out in your classroom, virtually or in person. Within this lesson, you would divide your class into groups, and you would assign each group to one of these 14 countries. Now, depending on how many students are in your class, you might assign fewer than 14 countries. You might only assign 3 or 4 of the countries that you see here. And of course, you could also choose countries that are more relevant to your subject area or your curriculum. Students would then analyze a set of photos of protests from their assigned country. All of these photo sets are available on Google Slides, which again is helpful as we continue to adapt to a virtual learning environment, whether that is a hybrid model or a fully online model. So students are able to access these photo sets from anywhere on any device, be it tablet, laptop, or phone. Within the student's assigned country group, they would then brainstorm as many questions as possible about the photos, thinking through what this protest might be about. How many people are protesting this? You know, who is the target audience that is protesting in this given scenario? Students would then choose 3 key questions from their brainstorming that they would like to answer and conduct research on. And Choices also provides a list of suggested media sources in order to guide students through their research. After researching their 3 key questions, students would then present their findings to the class. And as a class, you would facilitate a whole group discussion seeking to answer the question, what are some of the primary reasons for why there were major street protests around the globe in 2019, thereby building students' understanding of some of the general causes of this global protest wave. As a follow-on assignment or for homework, you might also ask students to write a reflection on the global protest wave and its broader meanings. Now, being in a virtual learning environment this year, this is a lesson that would work quite well using breakout groups on a virtual platform. So if you're using Zoom with your school, you might assign each country group to a breakout room, have them research and discuss with one another, and then bring your class together for a whole group discussion in the main room to address this question. This lesson also might work well as more of an independent research project for students to learn more about protests or movements in a particular country. Now, shifting gears a little bit, in finding student-appropriate resources to discuss and address global protests, PBS NewsHour is another great resource. They provide articles and free lesson plans for 7th through 12th grades, all of which are categorized by subject area. And each lesson includes a short video, a summary, discussion questions, and extension activities. Now, of course, when thinking about protests across the globe, the Black Lives Matter movement is pivotal. George Floyd's death has reverberated around the world, and the Black Lives Matter movement has truly gone global. Mr. Floyd's death has provoked popular protests in dozens of countries. And here I've just included a few photos of Black Lives Matter protests in France, Brazil, Senegal, China, Germany, Japan, Ecuador, Italy, England, Australia, Israel, and Tunisia. This movement has resonated with people across the globe, and it's certainly not limited to the US. I always try to remind students when I'm working with students that, we are not isolated in the US. We are not in a bubble. US news truly is world news, and what happens in the US reverberates across the world. So in light of this, another recent Teaching with the News lesson from the Choices program looks at the Black Lives Matter movement. For this movement, providing historical context for what's happening is critical. Presenting the movement in a contextualized way that helps students appreciate both its complexity and its importance. In order for us to better understand this history and the positions of Black activists and social movements today, it can be useful to examine significant recent events that led up to our present-day challenges. So this lesson provides an overview of Black activism for racial equality in the US since the 1950s. In this lesson, students review a timeline of Black activism in the US from the 1950s to today. Students identified core themes of civil rights, racial justice, and the Black Lives Matter movement. They will recognize patterns within and across different decades of activism, and will evaluate different platforms for activism and the role of social media in protests. Again, I'm going to walk you through a few of the key components of this lesson plan so that you can get a sense for if this might be a good fit for your students and your classroom. To start off this lesson, students will watch a video titled, "Why is it difficult to say when the civil rights movement began and ended?" by Professor Hamlin of Brown University. After watching this video and starting to think about the civil rights movement, you will then ask students to complete a brain dump of what they know about Black Lives Matter. So in the classroom, this could be done on the whiteboard or on a poster board. Virtually, you might choose to use Google Docs or Padlet. And in order to facilitate this brain dump, you might choose to use a KWL chart. For those of you that don't know what a KWL chart is, it's essentially 3 columns. And in the first column, you share what you know about a topic. In the second column, students consider what else they would like to know about a given topic, whether that's Black Lives Matter, civil rights, or racial justice in this case. And then in the third column, at the end of the unit or at the end of the lesson plan, students would share what they learned. So to facilitate this KWL chart or this brain dump, you might ask students, what is Black Lives Matter? What do you know about the movement's origins and goals? What have you seen on social media or in the news? How have people of varying backgrounds responded to the movement? What have you heard or seen about the protests against the police killing of George Floyd? Do you view these protests as connected to the Black Lives Matter movement? And what other questions do you have about recent events regarding race and racial justice in the US? So after students have started to think about this topic, you would then divide students into groups to analyze different periods of a timeline since the 1950s to today. Now, I will note that this timeline, while it covers many influential moments related to the history of Black activism in the US, it is by no means an exhaustive timeline. There are many people and movements, in addition to those highlighted, who played pivotal roles in activist efforts. So again, things could always be added to the timeline. It is by no means exhaustive, but it is quite an in-depth, helpful timeline to start thinking through these issues. So students in their assigned timeline groups would complete the graphic organizer and then share their findings with the class. And as each group presents, you would ask the rest of the class to fill in the relevant section of their graphic organizers. So again, virtually similar to the last lesson plan that we looked at, this might work well in breakout rooms. So you could assign students to a given breakout room for their time period, and then you would bring all of the students back together to the main room to share their findings and to further discuss. Now, as a class, you might also discuss the similarities and differences between social movements from the different decades of US history. So you could ask students to consider the themes and issues that seem to repeat themselves decade after decade. And of course, I would encourage you to bring it back to today's protests. So you might ask students, what impact has Black Lives Matter had on American society? Do you think that the street protests have been or will be effective? What makes a protest effective? How have different protest strategies changed and evolved throughout history? What does it mean for a social movement to be successful? And what factors might hinder the progress of certain social movements? Now, choices also includes a few additional challenges or extension activities that you might consider. You might encourage students to conduct an interview with someone who has participated in activism intended to overcome racial inequalities, either recently or at some point in the past. And you may wish to have students record or film these interviews and then share them with the class, which I think would be really lovely in a virtual environment. So you could start to compile a class library of interviews, whether they're, audio recordings or films. You might also ask students if there are any present day events taking place in their region or community that could be added to the timeline, and have students write a short description of the event and its significance. And you could also draw on local issues and struggles. Is there an active voice for racial equality at your school? If there is, who or what facilitates awareness and activism for racial equality on campus? If there's not, what is the significance of this absence? You may also wish to have students write down the steps that it would take to actually organize a group or an event for discussion and further learning about racial inequality. There is another recent Teaching with the News lesson that examines the protests by athletes against injustice, specifically looking at the NBA and WNBA's responses to the shooting of Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Within this lesson, students explore the perspectives, motivations, and goals of athletes protesting the shooting of Jacob Blake. Students analyze polling data and consider shifts in public opinion over time. Students assess historical continuities and changes in protests by athletes against injustice. And they consider achievements and limitations of collective action by athletes. Now, I'm not going to walk through this lesson plan with you, but I do encourage you to further explore this resource if you think it might be a good fit for your curriculum. For those of you that are interested in continuing to explore resources to discuss the Black Lives Matter movement with your students, I would also encourage you to explore Facing History and Ourselves. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this organization, but Facing History has compiled a robust library of articles, videos, and reflection questions, all of which are related to the Black Lives Matter movement. Facing History also provides a number of activities and strategies to break down issues for students. For example, they have one strategy that looks at the iceberg diagram, which is a fairly simple teaching strategy that helps students gain awareness of the numerous underlying causes that give rise to an event. So it's often difficult for students to see these underlying causes because they rest beneath the surface, or to use the iceberg metaphor, under the water. So you might use this diagram to break down a given topic with your students. And if we're thinking about the recent Black Lives Matter protests, you might write at the top of the diagram, George Floyd dies in the custody of the Minneapolis police. And at the bottom of the diagram, you might ask students to respond to questions including, what are the historical roots of police violence toward Black Americans? How does this history impact policing in the US today? This also might be a nice follow-on activity after the Choices program Black Lives Matter lesson that looks at that timeline and breaks it down, because students would have already dived into the historical roots and past events below the surface that have led to the tip of the iceberg that we are seeing today. So in this diagram, the visual image of an iceberg really serves to help students remember the importance of looking deeper than the surface in order to better understand events in the past or in the present. Again, this is a very simple activity that could be applied to nearly all movements across the globe. It is certainly not limited to the Black Lives Matter movement or the topic of global protests. And as we're experiencing, the public health crisis caused by the coronavirus outbreak has resulted in a major shift to online learning. We are all navigating new technologies and ways of teaching during a very challenging and uncertain time. And Facing History provides resources that are designed to help teachers approach online learning with a focus on sustaining community, supporting students, and creating engaging, meaningful learning experiences. They include a guide to develop classroom contracts, particularly through the lens of online learning environments, as well as strategies and resources to help you and your students connect in both synchronous and asynchronous digital spaces, and to create a safe space to foster a lot of these challenging discussions. So I have no doubt that you have all attended dozens of professional development sessions on adapting to virtual learning, but if you are interested, Facing History really does have some wonderful, robust resources. Another great resource to address Black Lives Matter is Teaching Tolerance, which is an organization that compiles helpful resources in addressing race, racism, and police violence in the classroom. And I'd also like to share a resource that is developed in-house at the Cleveland Council on World Affairs, which is our Junior World Affairs Councils, or JWACs. These are student-led or teacher-led materials that engage students in discussions on topics of international importance. Some of the topics include US-China relations, Turkey and the EU, refugees around the world, Taiwan identity politics, why peacekeeping fails, Haiti and the failures of foreign aid, Israel and Palestine, South Africa apartheid and the transition to democracy, South Africa and its parallels to the US, climate change as an international crisis, Saudi Arabia's role in the Middle East, and particularly relevant on the topic of global protests, we've also developed 2 new guides looking at the history of Hong Kong and its pro-democracy movement, as well as global protests and Black Lives Matter. So these guides can be used as either an extracurricular or student-led activity, or they could be used in the classroom setting. And within each guide, we provide discussion topics and access to reading materials, as well as opportunities for hands-on activities and cultural events that are happening in and around the Cleveland community. So if you are interested in accessing any of these Junior World Affairs Council's materials, please let me know and I can connect you with our manager of student programs. Finally, the National Education Association Ed Justice has compiled dozens of resources to help facilitate conversations about race, including classroom appropriate lesson plans and guides on how to have these difficult conversations with students. Their library of resources includes curriculum from more local and regional organizations, including Washington, D.C. Black Lives Matter, Rochester City Schools District, Rethinking Schools, and the Seattle Education Association. So again, these are more local and regional organizations and resources, but they are very high quality nonetheless. Now, there are many, many additional resources available online to address Black Lives Matter and this ongoing wave of global protests with students. But I hope that this provided a starting point and hopefully some ideas to start integrating this topic into your curriculum throughout the school year. So with that, I would just like to review our objectives. I hope that this webinar helped you to learn about resources and activities that are helpful in teaching and discussing global protests, including the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as to foster ideas to use these resources provided to discuss global protests, demonstrations, and movements in your classroom.